Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is Making America Sacred Again. This is the fourth in a series of interviews with my friend and neighbor, Dr. Glenn Aparicio Parry, who is the author of Original Politics, Making America Sacred Again. If you haven't watched the first three interviews in this series, I highly recommend that you check with our listings and take a look at them. That'll make this one much more interesting and meaningful for you. Glenn is also author of Original Thinking, a radical revisioning of time, nature, and humanity. Even though Glenn is my neighbor, this is an internet interview, and now I will switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Glenn. It's good to see you once again.
Very wonderful to be here, Jeff. Thank you, as always.
Now, today our focus is going to be on what is actually the subtitle of your book, Making America Sacred Again. And not all of our viewers will have had the benefit of watching the previous three interviews we've done, a lot of which has to do with Native American culture and their sense of the sacred. So let me begin by asking you, how would you define what is and is not sacred?
That's a great question. Obviously, my book subtitle is a play off of Donald Trump's Make America Great Again. And there's a huge difference between being great and sacred. You know, great I associate with the 1927 Yankees, Babe Ruth hitting 60 home runs. It's about being dominant, powerful. Sacred is an entirely different thing. Being sacred means to invoke the whole. It literally is connected with the word holy, and holy comes from whole. So when you're doing things in a very sacred way, you're inclusive. You're including the elements. You're including the light, air, water, earth. You're including all the people. You're including all the animals. You're including all the birds, the fish. You're being inclusive, that really is the major difference.
As I think about the previous history of America, we weren't inclusive from the beginning. Women didn't have the right to vote. We had slavery in this country. Even after the slaves were free, we engaged in warfare against the Native Americans. Many people describe it as genocide or near genocide, as a matter of fact. So I'm not sure America was ever whole in the sense you're describing.
Well, we talked about those things in previous interviews, but when I say making America sacred again, I'm not talking only about the nation. I'm talking about the land and also the way that people acted before there was the United States of America. This was still America. Of course, it was called Turtle Island then. So at that time, the way Native Americans conducted politics was done in a sacred way. I'm not saying it's perfect. It was perfect, but there was an intent to invoke the whole. It's really a Western idea about just doing politics for the people. So there was a time when the actions of human beings were considered and how it affects the whole. That's what I mean by sacred. And I would say, yes, that we were sacred before the United States was ever formed.
I do know, and it's probably worthy of addressing, there were comments from viewers on our previous interviews to the effect that we have to be careful not to romanticize indigenous peoples. They had their faults. They made war. I think some people say the indigenous peoples exterminated large mammals that used to exist.
Well, I personally don't believe all of that. There was a revisionist movement, from Shepard Kretsch, who wrote the Ecological Indian, and other authors that Jared Diamond, which tried to look back in time, and they said that Native Americans weren't all that ecological. They were actively working with the land. I would say this, Jeff, that comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what being ecological is. Being ecological isn't conserving as in hands off, which is kind of the Western idea of conservation, where let's set this land aside, like Yellowstone Park. My friend, a person that I worked with really closely, Leroy Little Bear, once went to Yellowstone Park, and he said to the park ranger, "Did you set Yellowstone apart to be an example of how we should operate everywhere, or did you set Yellowstone apart so that we could destroy everything else?" It's like, it is true that we should not over-romanticize Indians, which were done. The whole concept of the noble savage is a very long tradition of over-romanticizing Indians. Yes, they did have their wars, their skirmishes. Indians, and I'm using the word Indians, I hope that doesn't offend anybody. I said very early in my book, by the way, that I use a lot of words. I use Native American, Natives, Indians, etc. But in any case, no, Native American politics or Native American governments, Native American peoples are not perfect. But they did have a greater concept of including the whole. And that same concept was there in the West until the time of Socrates. That's when we started to shift the meaning of the greater good to be for human beings only. Really, Jeff, that's a major portion of the book, is I'm trying to expand the definition of politics to go beyond just human-centered.
But even if we keep it to the human-centered level, I know one of the very first points you make is that we have to start listening to each other again, that our politics has gotten so degenerated that the two political parties are in separate silos. They don't talk to each other as much as they need to. They don't listen to each other. They don't seem to be as interested in compromise as was traditionally the case.
Yes, that's very important. I mean, original politics ends with love, actually. But before we talk about love, we need to build a foundation of respect. So just like if you were building a home and you wanted your top floor to be the most beautiful spiritual A-frame meditation place, if that wouldn't work if your first floor was falling apart. The foundation of politics ought to be respect, and particularly in America, ought to be listening to the minority party. That came from Native America, that concept of deep dialogue, listening, not interrupting on the congressional floor. All those principles came from Native America, the 21 Iroquois braves that were there in the very inaugural meeting discussing the Declaration of Independence suggested and put in those protocols. So that's why we're different than over our mother country in Britain, where they yell and scream and pound their fist on the British Commons floor. So no, dialogue is very important. Regular order, and I know that doesn't sound like a sexy term, but regular order is, as they say, how the sausage is made. That's what John McCain implored the Congress to do in really the last days of his life. That's why he voted against Obamacare. He was very upset that...
You mean he voted against the repeal of Obamacare?
Thank you for that important correction. He voted against the repeal of Obamacare. Well, he wasn't even voting for Obamacare so much as he was voting against the messed up process. He didn't like that the Republicans had meetings in secret had not held any kind of committee meetings where amendments could be proposed or the minority party could have any input. And he was also upset at the Democrats who had passed Obamacare in a similar way. I mean, they didn't start out doing that, but the final product was passed through the reconciliation process after the Democrats lost their supermajority in the Senate. You know, they no longer had 60 votes. So they passed it through reconciliation. Remember when Scott Brown won in Massachusetts and they lost the supermajority? So that's what they did. And that's what pissed off the Republicans. And then the Republicans just took one wrong and made another wrong. And we've created a very dysfunctional process. It really goes back about 20 years where we're no longer working in as much compromise, as much regular order as we used to. And a lot of those processes that were built in, particularly to the Senate, were very good processes. We need to go back to them.
That's the foundation. If we're going to have a sacred nation, we have to start with regular order, treating each other with respect before we can begin to treat the land with respect, because we regard the land as even more other than the other party in a way. And you also point out that conservatism at one time meant conservation of our natural resources.
Yes. And I go into the difference between European or modern European conservatism and American conservatism, because it's very, very different. And it makes sense, perhaps, why it evolved that way. America was the land of plenty. The resources seemed infinite. You know, when Thomas Jefferson was telling people to, go out and find your own plot of land, when Abraham Lincoln was doing the Homestead Act and giving 160 acres to every American citizen or anybody who declared their citizenship to plot and to take care of their land. It was this idea that the resources were infinite, but that's not really true anymore. So what they learned in Europe, European conservatives do have a more developed ecological consciousness. They have a much smaller landmass. It was polluted and decimated a long time ago, and more recently, their consciousness is more attuned to resurrecting it. So I would say to all conservatives, it's right in your name, conserve what is important. And there's nothing more important than clean air, clean water, and good soil. And it wasn't that long ago that conservatives did believe that in the United States of America in the 1970s, although Richard Nixon did veto the Clean Water Act, and it was overturned because there was almost a complete consensus in the Congress for clean water, and there was and for clean air. And it was during the Nixon administration that we established the Environmental Protection Agency. So it wasn't very long ago, and really even up to George H.W. Bush, there was some cooperation between conservatives and liberals having to do with environmental issues. We've gone away from that. And to some degree, both parties are bought and paid for by lobbyists. But to a lesser degree, the Democrats perhaps, and that I'm getting into controversial waters here, at least it's the Democrats that are making a little bit more effort to preserve the ecology now. But I would argue it's the liberal progressive mentality that actually caused the most pollution if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, the idea of progress. That caused a lot of pollution. And now, ironically, it's the liberal progressives who are trying to clean it up, and the conservatives in America who are not. But true conservatives would want to conserve the land.
There is this issue in our culture these days of the rich versus the poor, the corporations, and with their need to exploit natural resources versus the nature and the ecology. And Native Americans, of course, have been pushed aside in order to put in oil pipelines across their land.
That's what Standing Rock was all about. And it was a good thing that Standing Rock penetrated consciousness, because it's really that, what Native people were saying is, we are the water, we are the air, we are the land, So when you pollute those things, you're polluting ourselves. It doesn't just work out for economic benefit. But of course, for your viewers who say that we're over-romanticizing Native Americans, it's true that a lot of Native tribes now vote in favor of polluting projects sometimes when they provide jobs. This has happened on the Navajo Nation sometimes, because, the Navajo Nation is very big, and there's a lot of enormous amount of unemployment and poverty, So it's hard. These are hard decisions for any person to make. There are trade-offs. Ideally, the Navajo Nation and a lot of the Southwest could be converted into solar, wind, those kinds of things could work and destroy the environment less. They're not perfect either. You have to use some petroleum to actually create solar, but that's complicated. Yeah.
We're in the middle of a pandemic right now. As we speak. That's why, even though you and I are neighbors, we're conducting this interview via the internet. And I think that I have heard from various guests on this program that say that the pandemic is in some way a reflection of our collective consciousness. I wonder how that fits into your notions of making America sacred again.
Oh, wow. What a beautiful thought. Yeah, there's some beautiful thinking coming out now with regard to the pandemic. I don't want to minimize the death and the suffering that the pandemic has caused, but this crisis is an opportunity to change. The cessation of incessant human economic activity obviously helped the land a little bit, and we began to see signs of that recently. Some of the signs are probably reported a little incorrectly. There was reports that, dolphins are coming into the Venice canals. They're probably always there. Nobody just saw them, but the water is getting clearer. Even the Ganges is getting clearer, and people are saying you could drink it. And I wouldn't advise that, but still, there is obvious. There's NASA, photographs showing climate change has been, the goals that we were making at the Paris Accords were actually far exceeded by stopping economic activity. But human beings would then have to figure out how could we live if we didn't have these kind of economic machines. And I think that is the question of the age. We're going to have to learn to not be addicted to economic growth in the same way we have. Because the economic growth covers up all the social ills as far as whether you're a liberal or a conservative. If you're a liberal and you want to spend on social programs, you need a lot of economic growth to reinvest. If you're a conservative and you want to cut taxes, you need economic growth to cover up that. So it doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you're on. Everybody's for economic growth. Even the independents, Bernie Sanders, they're for economic growth. But you know what? That has to change. That has to change. That's the mentality that has to change. There are people who've been talking about this for so long, as you know, like Herman Daly, a great economist, and there's a whole socially sustainable, I don't like the word sustainable, but that economic movement that is rethinking things, trying to give us new measures of well-being. All of this has been going on for 25 more years. I'm sure, we've probably interviewed Hazel Henderson or whatever, and these people that have been talking about this. But now we have an actual case scenario where we can see the results when we roll back. So I would propose that we find a way to have rolling moratoriums on economic activity in different nations. And and just enough to give the earth a breather and enough to start rethinking how we should live.
I hear from people, young people in particular, who are really questioning the capitalist model that we have inherited, where they go to college and they come out deeply in debt. And then they have to struggle to find a job that they're going to hate most of their lives. I think the statistics show that 99% of working people do not like their jobs. In fact, many of them out and out hate their jobs. So people are wondering, what is the point? You build up huge debt in order to get a job that you're going to hate for the rest of your life, and then you die. It seems as if that's very, very far from a sacred lifestyle.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, all of this is coming up and being considered, and some of the programs that some of the Democratic candidates for president proposed actually had to go into, started with COVID-19. So Andrew Yang was talking about giving $1,000 to every American per month, right? But that, so far it was only a one-time thing, but every American who the IRS could track, I guess, which is not every American, but still, if they didn't earn over a certain income, I think it was 200,000, got a check, but it wasn't a check. Sometimes it was a debit card, which is really hysterically funny. I mean, I don't know if they're trying to get people to spend money with that. I'm not sure. Probably.
Coming back to Native Americans, as we talk about before the founding of this country, they seem to live rather well without the benefit of running water, without the benefit of electricity, without the benefit of vaccines or credit cards or police or courts. And I even recall reading about anthropologists in the early days who would go live amongst the natives, give up all of the benefits of civilization, and some of them report they were never happier.
Oh, yeah. That's what Benjamin Franklin said in the 18th century, that anyone who has tasted savage life, doesn't go back to European civilization. And I know most people will think that's just a racist slur, and perhaps it was, but the word savage has changed over time. So it really meant wild and untamed in the 18th century. And Ben Franklin had really very beautiful friendships with Native Americans. I don't think he was a racist, but he used those words, and it was commonly used as a way to describe Native people because they were comfortable in the wild. It is a complex subject that you just brought up, but I agree with you, and it bothers me when well-intentioned organizations go into third world countries to say, okay, we're going to give you clean water now. It doesn't, what bothers me about it is just that the fact that the reason why they need clean water is because that same, the Western civilizations came in and generally destroyed the water. The traditional agriculture didn't so much. Now, maybe to some degree, traditional did destroy water. When the populations were lower, there was maybe more, the water was able to clean itself a little bit better than when the populations grew. I mean, there's some complexity there that I'm leaving out. But a lot of, there are people like Vandana Shiva I really, really admire, who spent a lot of time all over the world, but in India she began, and she was an amazing person who was a physicist too, but she also talked about revitalizing traditional agriculture and traditional ways of working with the environment. Those are good to revitalize because there's a lot of wisdom there. And I'm very much in support of that.
I've also been reading some anthropology that suggests that when it comes to this idea of the sacred, Native Americans and indigenous North American people in particular were all mystics. As you pointed out earlier, they identified themselves with the land. They didn't think of themselves, to use the famous phrase I think we've referred to earlier by Alan Watts, a skin-encapsulated ego. They had a different vision of what it meant to be human.
Yeah. In real succinct terms, their indigenous definition of what it means to be human has to do with your connection to the rest of humanity. Whereas the Western definition, at least since the Renaissance on, has had to do with our separation from the rest of creation. And that's been reflected in the way we think and in our languages. Our languages are subject-object divisive in Indo-European languages, where indigenous languages are much more immersive. They're verb-oriented, So, if you want to be an ecologist, you cannot have this attitude of we're separate. You have to immerse yourself. You have to live, and Western society is figuring this out. I don't want to be too negative here. Let's give some credit here. So let's look at the early anthropologists like Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead. They began, just like other anthropologists, trying to do a scientific study of the community, right? And they would park themselves outside someplace and look in. And Gregory Bateson even did a film early on, I don't remember the title of it or anything, about a culture, and he showed it to them, and the people's reaction was, why are you filming things that are so unimportant? Because he wasn't living, but then he got it. He totally got it, and Margaret Mead totally got it, and they started living what's now called participatory action research. They lived amongst the people. They became part of the tribe as much as possible. That's the only way you can be accepted. That's the only way you can become a friend. That's the only way you can actually understand what's going on. And the same thing is true of the natural world. If we're studying it from a distance, we can't really feel it. We have to be in it. We have to immerse ourselves in the natural world. We have to feel the water in our veins. We have to feel the air coming through us. We have to feel the sun, and participate with it. And then there's a chance that we're going to then we'll fall in love with it. Love with nature. And if we fall in love with nature, then we're going to treat each other better too.
You told me earlier that ultimately making America sacred again is about love. And it's one of the most overused words, of course, in the English language, and one of the most difficult to talk about. But I know that's what you're getting at. So let's open up the discussion about love.
Sure. Well, I can't remember the exact quote, but I quote my friend James O.D., who speaks about not keeping your heart full all the time. Let it empty, let it fill. And then you'll find out when you do that love is not something you create. Love is a natural property of the universe. And so by letting your heart empty, then it can be refilled naturally. That was a beautiful thought, because yes, you're right. The word has kind of been overused and stuff, but love is what binds things together. Love is what connects things as a whole. Love is what dissolves dichotomy and polarization, frustration. Love brings women and men together, and of course, it brings men and men, women and women. But it brings people together who have some differences, and it dissolves the difference. Love is like water. That's what I say in here. Love is of the heart. The heart is of water, and because of this, that's kind of the secret. I mean, this actually, I told a story in my previous books. I might have in Original Thinking about an experience I had in Costa Rica, and I could share that with you now, where I had this vision of being a dolphin, and as a dolphin, I dive down deep into the ocean, and then just before I get to the bottom of the ocean, I realize I'm a river dolphin. So I start coming back up, and I come back up, and I'm saying I, but in a dream, it's just consciousness. Consciousness moves up into the sky, far up in the sky, and is looking down upon the dolphin that's come up from the bottom of the ocean and is now swimming back toward the mouth of the river. And then consciousness goes further and further apart, and I see many, many rivers that are flowing together into the ocean, and I feel the beating of the heart of Mother Earth. And ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. And that was one of the most ecstatic visions I ever had. And I came back and I shared it with Grandfather Leon Secatero, who was a dear elder, the head man of the Cañoncito Band of Navajo. And he said something like, "That's good, Glenn, because that is the way it is. The rivers are Mother Earth's ventricles, and the streams are the capillaries. You know, it's all connected, just like that. And the reason why we're having heart disease on the planet now is because we're damming up the rivers. And we're water beings. The planet is a water being, and we're connected in that way. And I think that's why love is the answer.
One of the real issues that you have raised throughout your book is this, that if we're going to right the wrongs that have historically occurred in this country, including, I think, genocide, particularly with regard to Native Americans, we have to look at our dark side. We can't really get in touch with the fullness of our capacity to love if we don't have some sort of reconciliation with our own demonic nature.
That's very true. That's very, very true. And I make that point in the book. And Donald Trump, I mean, ironically, I mention him in my acknowledgments. He's the last person I acknowledge for his perhaps unwitting role of being a catalyst for the unveiling of the American shadow. So that has happened. It also happened under Obama's presidency, not because Obama necessarily did anything bad, but because he was the first African-American president. And what has been happening for quite some time now is that Americans are beginning to see themselves the way they really are. And that has an amazing benefit. The shift in consciousness, and Jeff, you've been talking about shifted consciousness. I've been talking about shifted consciousness for so long. It seems like it's really happening now before our eyes. The shifted consciousness in just a month in white America, vis-a-vis how police treat minorities, was amazing. It was something like jumped from 25% to 70%. 25% of white Americans used to think that it was only a few bad apples in the police department that treated minorities unfairly. Now it's almost 70%, and I'm not sure if I'm on the right statistic, but pretty close to that, are aware of, they're finally awakened to the fact of systemic racism that has existed. So yeah, we do have to confront our shadow. We do have to be kind to each other first, and then love. So yeah, I mean, if I'm putting love too forward, that is a danger. But that's not the way I wrote the book. The love is the very last thing.
Well, Glenn, Aparicio, Parry, once again, a delightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with me and with our audience.
Well, thank you for bringing your presence, your knowledge, your wisdom every day. So thank you, Jeff. It's a joy to be with you.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.